Hi, I am Mike Wheeler. We're here at the Mark Center Alexandria campus of the Institute for Defense Analyses. We're continuing our discussion with General Welch on issues raised by the nuclear age.
Okay.
Let's talk about proliferation for a while. We were talking about a number of other issues this morning. At the start of the nuclear age, the president's advisors were telling him, you're not going to keep these secrets, that the thing will proliferate over time. And in many ways, it's amazing that we were able to contain proliferation as much as we did for the Cold War. The United States got nuclear weapons, Britain, Soviet Union next, then Britain, then France, then China, then India tested. Israel was largely suspected of having a nuclear weapon by that time. And that brought us through the Cold War pretty much. But as we were coming out, of course, there was the Iraq situation. And in the immediate aftermath of evicting Saddam Hussein's forces and then having an enforced disarmament regime, the United States and the world community discovered that he had really had a covert nuclear weapons program going on for a long period of time. You had a nuclear nonproliferation treaty in place. He was a party to that treaty and was still able to get around the kind of inspection regimes there were and that sort of thing. And so a lot of attention began to be paid to the dangers of nuclear proliferation after we got out of the Cold War. We were talking earlier about, in many ways, the Cold War was kind of a simpler problem because you had a central focus, but now you have all kinds of focuses that you take. The India and Pakistan, of course, both went nuclear to actually get the weapons in 1998. North Korea basically is well along on its nuclear weapons program with nuclear testing. Iran was suspected of having a nuclear weapons program. And so one of the responses we had to the proliferation challenge was missile defense. Let's talk about missile defense. We'll talk about, assuring allies and how that deals with proliferation on another occasion. Let's talk about missile defense for a while.
Well, when President Reagan announced the defensive umbrella, the logic was impeccable. Wouldn't we like to stop a few of those instead of spending all our money on offense? Wouldn't you like to save some lives? But generally speaking, the Joint Chiefs' response to that was pretty negative. And it was negative in the sense that what we saw was this will be an enormous expenditure of resources with no assurance of a return on investment. Because there really wasn't a concept of how one would do that. But it was the President's program. And so that we embarked on it and supported it. I think over time reality set in. That is that a shield against a massive attack, we don't know how to do that. And you may recall that President Clinton, in fact, he specifically asked that a group be formed to tell him if, in fact, we were ready to deploy a missile defense. I chaired that group, and we told him, no, we're not, and gave him just sort of a set of things that had to happen before we could deploy an effective missile defense. And a new level of reality set in on two levels. One is we had accomplished a lot. That is, we in fact could do some things that we thought were very difficult. We had the Patriot system, the THAAD system, the Navy Aegis system, which were quite effective at intercepting classes of ballistic missiles in the terminal phase. We had proved that we can hit a bullet with a bullet in mid-course, which very challenging task. But then we also, by that time, was fairly clear what we could not do. IDA, at the request of the Missile Defense Agency, had formed the White Team.
Mm-hmm.
And the White Team's job was to listen to the Blue Team that said, this is how we'll solve problems,
Mm-hmm.
to listen to the Black Team, which was an informed Red Team, that would say, and here's how we'll defeat your solution.
Mm-hmm.
And our job was to tell the Missile Defense Agency what we thought ground truth was and how to proceed. From all of that, it became fairly obvious that, and widely accepted, that what it would take to actually deal with a large raid was just not, it was just
Mm-hmm.
too expensive, too difficult. So then the objective was matched to what the leadership saw as a real threat. Because if you look at the proliferators, very different set of motivations.
Mm-hmm.
That Pakistan and India, the motivation is very straightforward. It's each other. North Korea's motivation is very straightforward. If they didn't have nuclear weapons, nobody would care anything about them.
Mm-hmm.
Iran's a bit more mysterious. That is, why does Iran think they need nuclear weapons? So that was a little more difficult to deal with. But then the goal, as announced by President George W. Bush, was just to deal with those low-level, relatively unsophisticated threats.
Mm-hmm.
And that proved to be doable. Now, whether or not you deal with them with just effective defense, or whether or not you deal with them with a combination of effective defense and uncertainty, I don't need to decide that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think over time, the demonstration of what we really do know how to do and matching that with what we know we don't know how to do has produced a pretty realistic set of expectations, which is not President Reagan's SHIELD.
Yeah, it wasn't the Strategic Defense Initiative,
Yeah.
the SHIELD. One of the early assumptions that was made in strategic thinking when it was kind of in the 1960s, 1970s time frame on do you go after this kind of thing, was the question of whether or not it would be destabilizing in the Russian-American relationship if we kind of had an open-ended arms race that was going after missile defense. And that was resolved in terms of the rather complicated arrangements we had in the ABM Treaty that was signed in 1972. And the ABM Treaty had a sovereign right of withdrawal in it, but it limited what your defenses could be.
Mm-hmm.
And we remained in that treaty until President George W. Bush announced that we were going to withdraw, and then did withdraw. The Soviets, or really the Russians by that time, didn't denounce very vigorously at the moment that we withdrew from it. But there's strong evidence that there's a lot of sentiment in the Russian military and the Russian strategic community that is still suspicious that we have the capabilities with the missile defense, and it's unfettered now by a treaty, to basically, when you combine it with everything else we have, precision strike and everything else, to defeat a Russian retaliatory launch. How do you explain this to your Russian, when you get into track 2 discussions? How do you engage your Russian counterparts on this?
I think that we're dealing with a combination of real concern and political opportunity. That if the Russians truly believe that anything that we plan to deploy, either in Europe or as a strategic missile defense in the U.S., if they really believe that that provides some kind of threat to a Russian-sized nuclear capability, then they would have to be incredibly poorly informed.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't believe that.
Mm-hmm.
I think they were much more concerned with increased U.S. presence in Eastern Europe than they were with the actual effectiveness in terms of their systems.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that a radar in Czechoslovakia or that a limited deployment in Poland was actually a counter to the Russian capability never made any sense.
Mm-hmm.
But their sensitivity actually stopped our deployment to Czechoslovakia,
Mm-hmm.
with, by the way, some unexpected consequences in the rest of the world. So I don't know how to sort out real concern, which, I take you back to Akhmerayev's true belief.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to do it,
You can do it.
you can do it,
Mm-hmm.
and then we will not be able to deal with that.
Mm-hmm.
So is there still some of that, even after there's much more clarity about how difficult this is?
Mm-hmm.
There probably is, but I think it's mostly political opportunism on
Okay.
their part.